Jared, I cannot believe you are back on the Rule Your Pool podcast with me. I've had Joe in your place, and honestly, it's really nice to have you back. I hope you didn't listen to the last episode.
No, I did not, because I can only listen to the episodes that I'm in. So I'm
Yeah,
happy to be here so I can finally start listening again.
yeah, good, because you've missed out on a lot of stuff. Today, we're going to talk about a topic that you and I get a lot on the Orenda hotline from homeowners and pool service professionals alike, really. It's summertime, and if you have a saltwater pool, you have probably seen calcium issues in your pool, namely calcium flakes and calcium flakes that blow out of your returns and issues like that of various forms of scale. You have anything specific you want to mention before we get into it?
No, I mean, it's just I've noticed an uptick in the amount of phone calls and requests about this specific topic. And, a lot of times it's not always known what it is. It just starts as a generalized questioning of a sediment in their cleaner bag or just on the floor, and they don't know exactly where it came from. So it's never just a flat out, this is scale coming from my salt cell. It's always framed in a way of, I need help with this problem. And it's just seeming like it's becoming more prevalent now. And obviously it's heating up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, water temperature definitely plays a big role in that. So without further ado, episode 34 of the Rule Your Pool podcast. Welcome to Rule Your Pool, the podcast by Orenda that explains and simplifies pool chemistry so that anybody, regardless of experience, can understand it. I'm your host, Eric Knight, bringing clarity to these subjects so that you can bring clarity to your water. If you're ready to rule your pool, then let's go. Now, Jared, I can't help but notice you don't have the fancy microphone in front of you. What's the deal?
Someone used it last time they were here for an episode you may have watched previously and did not bring it back.
Look, I may or may not have been that someone. Can you imagine a Rule Your Pool podcast where we're actually in the same room?
That would be pretty loud.
Oh my God, I don't even know how we would do it. Well, anyway, we're going to hope that your audio quality stays good. As Jared mentioned, when people call us, nobody calls and says, hey, I have calcium flakes blowing out of my salt cell. They're not that specific. I have calcium all over my pool, or I've got scale issues, or I've got this weird dust, or I've got, my favorite is shaved ice. It looks like snow cone ice in my vacuum bag or on the bottom of my pool. What's going on? Have you seen this? The answer is yes. Yes, we have seen it. We have seen it so many times we are kind of sick of seeing it because it's such a big problem. You are not alone if you have this issue. So, Jared, what's going on? Let's try to summarize it and then let's dig a little deeper.
A lot of it, honestly, is kind of what we preach in general as far as range chemistries and, kind of our, guide to maintaining a pool is not really the focus, and we're hoping to change that by anybody listening on this podcast. That's the goal here, but you have to consider the LSI when addressing a problem like this, because the homeowner or the service guy or whoever's installing the salt cell, they've been taught range chemistry more than likely, and so when they're referring to maintenance, they're saying, well, my alkalinity is at 100 or 120, my calcium's in range, I lower my pH every week, and all these things that they're, quote unquote, they're correct. But when you're dealing with a salt pool and a salt cell specifically, it kind of changes the ball game for maintenance. And that's really what we walk people through when they call is, okay, yes, you are doing things the right way, but you need to change your habits in your maintenance to better support your salt generator.
Well, I would say you're not doing it the right way for a salt pool. You're doing it the right way based on what the textbook said, but that textbook is not referring to a salt pool. That's just general guidelines for range chemistry. Here again, why we at Orenda, we do not teach range chemistry. Because ranges are only good at a certain temperature at a certain time of year with a certain type of chlorine for the most part, because there's always going to be other factors like your primary chlorine and the current temperature of your water that are going to change the LSI. So the LSI always comes first, then you can think about ranges later. And in fact, in order to prevent this problem, Jared, what's the first question we usually ask? I mean, actually, I don't know what you usually ask. I know what I do. What's your first question when someone calls you about this?
What is their alkalinity?
That's exactly what I asked too. What's your alkalinity? And now, why do you think we ask that question first? Put yourself
I
in
know
the
the
shoes of someone, you know the answer, but put yourself in the shoes of someone who doesn't.
Well, because generally when you're taught range chemistries and alkalinity, we're always taught that alkalinity is your buffer for pH. And as anybody that's maintained a pool with the salt generator, you know the pH is always climbing and going up.
Hmm.
Every time they come back the following week, it's always 8.0 plus.
Oh, yeah.
Well, we're taught, well, get a higher alkalinity and it'll help buffer that swing in pH, which we researched and found, and it's technically not accurate.
No, it's not accurate at all. In fact, it's only accurate in one direction, and that is buffering against the reduction in pH because total alkalinity, as we discussed in I think maybe episode 3, 2 or 3 when we dug into it, is actually a source of rising pH. It's more carbonates in your water. And as we explained in the Henry's Law episode of why pH naturally rises, that absolutely comes into play here. The only difference is your salt chlorine generator is accelerating the rise in pH because it's producing two things as byproducts. Now, actually, there's several others, but two that are relevant to this LSI conversation. One of them, the main one, is sodium hydroxide. Very high pH, about 13 to 13 and a half. Sodium hydroxide, also known as caustic soda, is going to raise the pH in your pool. Okay, of course, it also produces in the salt cell chlorine gas, but that's not going to affect the LSI in this way. The other thing is a salt cell produces heat. Now, electrolysis is basically electricity arcing between the blades, and that electricity breaks down sodium chloride, converts it into chlorine, sodium hydroxide, blah, blah, blah.
Did you hear
That
that?
process, go ahead.
Converts it into what?
It, what did I say? Did I say it wrong?
No, I'm just making sure you converts it into chlorine.
Yeah, it converts it into chlorine. Oh, yeah,
What?
I see what you're saying. Yes. Believe it or not, a salt pool is a chlorine pool. Okay, I was like, man, did I say it wrong? Maybe I did.
We should
Okay,
have
yes.
rehearsed before we did this, guys. Sorry, everybody.
We don't rehearse. We don't rehearse. Clearly, we don't rehearse because Jared would have his good microphone if we did.
True.
So, sorry, Jared. I don't mean to hurt your feelings.
We'll discuss later.
Oh, crap. Okay. So, yes, you're running electricity through your salt cell and water's flowing through there. Let's say standard backyard pool, 60 gallons per minute or so. Now, on a bigger pool, it's going to be faster, but let's say 60 gallons per minute. That's not a lot of time. Water's moving pretty fast. And so that electricity is going through there and it's converting salt into chlorine, sodium hydroxide, and the byproduct of that is heat. So inside that salt cell, you actually have a very high LSI, super high pH, and on the cathode side, I should say, on the cathode side of the salt cell, you're going to have that really high pH being created. And then you have heat. So normally, you don't get much scale in a salt cell if water is flowing. Okay, because it's just not quite enough time to precipitate it. It can happen over time, but it's not going to happen in a day or a week or something like that. Usually, scale is formed when the water is off. Immediately after the pump shuts off or immediately after the salt cell turns off, now you have stagnant water. You have water just sitting in that salt cell. It's still hot. That cell is trying to cool down, which means it's transferring its heat into the water. You still have sodium hydroxide nearby that was just produced. That's when you get the most scales I guess I should speak English. That's when you get the most scale precipitation in your salt cell. Now, that brings me to the next point. We're going to talk about how to prevent this in just a few minutes, but if you have this creation of scale when the water's off, the new variable speed pumps, Jared, they can be programmed to run 24/7. In fact, you can ramp them down and save a whole bunch of energy. This is not so much of an issue on variable speed pump pools that do run 24/7. Is that your experience too?
Yeah, but that really depends on I mean, any environment can be ripe for scale, regardless if it's running 24/7. I mean, if you have a 600 part calcium and a super high pH that's going unmaintained and a super high alkalinity, you can form scale. Now, granted, it's going to be just harder, but
Mm-hmm.
it will happen. So all those things come into play. But yeah, it's going to be more of these come into play with residential pools that turn on, turn off. They run for, I don't know, 6, 8 hours, 10 hours a day. And when they sit there overnight or for the next 14 hours,
Hmm.
they scale up, and then they turn back on and repeat. So then you just get this layering effect of scale on scale on scale on scale inside of these salt cells. And eventually it's just too much.
Hmm. And that's when, well, we're going to talk about reversing polarity, because when it does build up enough on these salt cells, you got to think of a salt cell, if you've never seen one, as a whole bunch of thin metal sheets, or blades, if you want to think of them like that. Some of them have, I don't know, maybe a 1/4 inch apart. They're probably a lot closer, maybe 1/8 of an inch apart.
Yeah,
They're pretty
they're
close.
pretty close.
Yeah, so maybe 1/8 of an inch apart. They're close to each other, and there's quite a few of them in there. And water is going right down and being divided between these lanes of metal fins. And if you look at our website, or actually if you look at the salt cell itself, plenty of sources online, you'll see what I'm talking about. If you go onto the Orenda app and you look in articles and you type in salt or you type in flake, you're going to find our articles that explains what we're talking about in this episode today. And you could just share that article with one of your friends who needs to read it or whatever. But in there, we have a diagram. Go
Okay,
ahead.
there are 2 articles that I send to everybody that calls with this problem. It is
Mm-hmm.
salt cell flakes in my salt pool, or
Mm-hmm.
flakes in my, salt pool, and Henry's Law.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the 2 that I send to everybody.
Well, they're relevant. They're both relevant. So water's flowing through this, and in those articles, actually not in the Henry's Law one, but in the salt cell one, I have this beautiful diagram, Jared, that I illustrated myself. That's why it's beautiful. And by beautiful, when you look at it, you're going to be like, wow, didn't know Orenda could hire a 4th grader to be their illustrator, but good for Orenda. Well, we believe in equality here. But anyway, water's flowing through, and what happens, Jared, in a normal salt cell average day? Let's say you're running it at 100%. Okay, and I want you to explain what the percentage means to the listeners, because you and I know what it is, but I get a lot of questions. Well, what do you mean percent? Do you get those questions too?
I don't get those questions really, but my service background tells me what the answer is. But I think there's a lot of misperception on that percentage and what it actually means. People think that, well, it is exactly what it means. When it's saying 100%, that means it's running 100% of the time with no breaks and constantly producing chlorine and, being overworked, in my opinion. And
Mhm.
when you have the option to reduce the output on that unit, you're, number one, you're saving the longevity, right? Not as much wear and tear. And you're running, let's say you select 50% output, that means you're running that unit 50% of the time. Now, granted, that doesn't mean it turns on, runs for 5 hours out of the 10-hour cycle and turns off for the next 5. No, it's broken down into way smaller units than that. You're talking seconds here where it's on and off, on and off, on and off. So there's no one way to do a half cycle on, half cycle off for a 10-hour cycle of your pump. It's just running for half of a, let's call it, you know, 30 seconds out of a minute.
Well, yeah, I've also heard some are on 10-minute increments, so that if you're at 70%, you run for 7 minutes, you're off for 3. Then you run for another 7 minutes. It just depends on the manufacturer. It depends on the settings. We don't make equipment here at Orenda, so ask your manufacturer, ask your installer. They're going to know a lot more than we do. But it's like Jared said, it's not hours and hours where you have circulation and no chlorine production. That's not how it works. But in between that on and off cycle is something called reversing polarity. And what that means is the electricity changes directions. Instead of going from left to right, it's now going from right to left. And in that process, the cathode side versus the anode side changes. And that process of changing the direction of electricity actually fractures a lot of this scale off. And that is what blows into your pool as flakes. It looks like crushed eggshells. And it's a huge problem. Like I said at the beginning, if you have this issue, you are not alone. It's also relatively harmless too. It's not like the biggest deal in the world.
No, it's cosmetic mainly. And most of the time you will see it in one of two places. It's going to either be in your spa, if you have a spa, or it's going to be on the closest return to the pool equipment.
Mhm.
So if that is the case, that is where you will find these flakes.
Now, why would it be in the spa before the pool?
Because normally on a pool return system, your spa has an overflow. So it's
Mhm.
diverting water from the pool circulation into the spa. And when that cell fractures the flakes off of it, it's just diverting it. So it's going to
Okay.
be in your pool as well, but a lot of times it's going to be in the spa.
Or a higher percentage will be in the
Yes,
spa because more water was diverted that way. Okay, that
correct.
makes sense. I actually didn't know the answer to that, so I'm glad I asked. But you're right. I've observed the same thing. It's usually in the spa or on the bench nearest the equipment set is going to be the first place you see it. Now, over time, these pure white flakes that look like crushed eggshells, they tumble around in your pool. So let's say, you're a professional service guy, for some reason listening to us on this podcast. Thank you for being here. But let's say you're gone for a week. You're only there for 30 minutes a week, and throughout that week, that pool is circulating, and those flakes are tumbling around. There's a lot of friction on the bottom of a pool. What happens is they kind of get smoothed out, and they start to get a little bit more translucent, and they start looking like snow cone ice. This is what the vacuum tends to pick up. Is that your experience too, Jared?
Yeah, and a lot of times by the time it reaches the vacuum and in the bag, it looks almost like sand.
Yeah. Well, it just keeps
Yeah,
tumbling and
it's
wearing
just
down.
grinding it down and it
Mhm.
looks like sand.
Yeah, it's not a very hard material. If you pull out a flake with your finger and thumb, you could just like kind of rub it into
Easily.
dissolving it. I mean, it's not rock hard by any means. So it is soft. It's just kind of going with the flow of water, literally, and it's just getting worn down. So that's where that comes from. Now, there are other forms of scale that happen in salt pools. You could just have, well, standard scale. I mean, you have a higher pH, it's a hot day, you run the spa or whatever. Even if you don't run the spa, if it's hot enough, you're going to have it on the tile line, you're going to have it on the spillway, the standard places. That is largely due to an LSI violation that the salt cell is certainly not helping. So back to what we were saying just a moment ago, alkalinity is the first question that Orenda asks when we hear about any of these issues. When I hear you have a salt pool, that's the first question I want to know, because you want to be able to leverage physics on your side. You've got a system that is driving up your pH constantly. Well, I mean, as long as it's being operated. So if we know what the pH ceiling is, well,
And not just we know what the pH ceiling is, and we know what pH carbonate is introduced into the water or
or
when
converted.
it can form scale.
Oh man, you just complicated the episode,
I
but in a
did.
good way. In a good way. Now I gotta have to discombobulate my brain. So I was going in one path, and now I have to bring in another path. So yes, what you just said is absolutely true. When you know how high your pH can go, thanks to Henry's law, if you have not seen the charts, it is in several of our articles. But if you just type in CO2 or control pH versus containing it, which
Or
is a recent
type in
article,
Henry.
or Henry, yeah, you'll find it in the articles section of the Orenda app and on our website. You're going to find out that it's based on your carbonate alkalinity that determines your pH ceiling. Now, what Jared said, this is the second path that I have to bring in here. If you look on our website and type in the word alkalinity, you're going to see a whole bunch of articles. And in those articles, you're going to see a chart. And it's an equilibrium chart that shows the pH determines the percentage of what type of alkalinity you have in your pool. At 8.3 on that chart, bicarbonate ions convert into carbonate ions because they lose a hydrogen. Carbonate ions are what look for calcium, because carbonate ions are what bind to calcium. And that is calcium carbonate, which forms scale. Most of this calcium carbonate is in solution, but on the LSI, if you get high enough on the LSI, Jared, what happens to that calcium carbonate?
You will create that calcium carbonate bond in scale.
Well, close. No, you already have some. You have too much of it, right? It's like too much sugar in your drink.
Oh yeah,
I
too
think
much carbonate.
I asked it in a confusing way. That was not meant to be a leading question. So you have too much calcium carbonate, and it starts to precipitate out because it has to. The water can't hold it anymore. The LSI is too high. And this is a recurring challenge for salt pools. So just as a recap of that, and then let's get into how we actually fix it.
Well, I want to use an example here, though. Well,
Mm-hmm.
according to our pH ceiling at 80 degrees, which right now it's the summertime, that's a realistic number, right?
Sure.
Well,
It's probably more
well,
like 85 degrees, but okay.
so let's just say 100 degrees on the Henry's Law ceiling. That pushes our pH to 8.41 at 100 carbonate alkalinity. So you'd have to have roughly 100 to 120 total alkalinity for that to be the case. But let's
Right.
just
That's
use this
because of the
for
correction from CYA and whatever
correct.
else.
So,
Okay.
so let's just use this for convenient ease of information. If you maintain 100 alkalinity, carbonate alkalinity, you have an 8.41 pH ceiling. That is 100. That is absolutely past the 8.3 scale forming range.
Yeah. And that's
So that is
scale
why,
forming because bicarbonates convert into carbonates at 8.3.
exactly. So I'm just showing why we do not like a high alkalinity with
Yeah.
a salt pool.
Triple digit alkalinity has no place in a saltwater pool when the salt cell is warm, when the water's warm enough for the salt cell to operate. So if you're like going to winterize your pool, of course, that's a different story because your salt cell doesn't even work below what, 50 degrees, 55 degrees Fahrenheit?
Yeah. So, and this is leading us into our solution, right?
Yeah, it is.
So let's go there.
Okay. Well, you take the lead, man. I'll ski downhill and follow you.
So yeah, the solution every time is obviously I'm sending everybody these articles on Henry's Law and Flakes in my pool, so that they can read and get a better understanding of what we're talking about. Now, first thing I tell them is, hey, you need to maintain your alkalinity closer to 70 parts, and by doing that, from our example earlier at 100 carbonate alkalinity at 8.41 pH, if I say you need to maintain a 70 alkalinity, which is probably going to be roughly a 60 carbonate alkalinity after everything's computed, right? That changes your pH ceiling down to 8.2, which is below the magic number of 8.3.
Mm-hmm.
So that in conjunction with obviously managing the LSI is a critical thing that we promote here. So manage your LSI, but we also recommend the use of our SC1000, our scale and metal control, to help chelate that calcium
Right.
in the water.
And that's not the crux of the solution. That's something that gives you grace to
Exactly.
be able to do the solution much easier because that's what binds to calcium so that carbonate doesn't. So that you have less chance of having scale formation. Even if you are slightly high on the LSI for a time, it's going to be much harder. It's going to take it inhibits. I can't even say it. It inhibits scale formation. Did I
It's your
say that
friend
right?
in the water. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's your friend in the water.
Whew, I'm glad I got through that, man. That was a tongue twister. Okay, so that is exactly true. So we want to be aware of our carbonate alkalinity. As a refresher, that's not the same thing as total alkalinity. Carbonate alkalinity is just bicarbonate and carbonate ions. Anything you see on that graph. So there is cyanurate alkalinity. If you use borate, there is borate alkalinity too. To some degree, there's some other things too, but they're really not measurably worth mentioning. But cyanuric acid 100% is. So you take about a third of your CYA and you deduct that number from your total alkalinity, and that is what you need to reference on the chart in the Henry's Law article and the others. That's where you're going to find your pH ceiling at a given temperature. I want to make something
Correct.
clear though. When you are correcting these things on the app is asking you to put in your total alkalinity. You don't actually see the carbonate alkalinity on the Orenda app. That happens behind the scenes, and you know that because when you adjust the CYA number, cyanuric acid stabilizer, the LSI changes. We get that question all the time. Oh, what about, is this the carbonate alkalinity or the total?
Mm-hmm.
We should probably make some sort of disclaimer, but people don't read our disclaimers, Jared. They listen to our podcast, though, which is astounding.
Good.
Put in your total alkalinity, put in your CYA, it will make that correction. But for you to know what your carbonate alkalinity is, just take a third of your CYA, deduct it. That's the first thing. Monitor your carbonate alkalinity. Now, Jared said 70. Okay, 70 is pretty good for Dallas. What about Tucson? What about Palm Springs? What about 120 degree weather? What about Miami? Man, I was just in South Florida. It was hot. It was so hot down there. The water was 88 degrees. You might not even need 70 there. You could go down to 60. But here's what I'm going to tell you.
Well,
You cannot go that low on your alkalinity
Correct.
unless you have enough calcium hardness in your water to not bottom out your LSI when you make that correction.
And that's why you really have to take the LSI into consideration too, because you're correct. The water temperature is driving up the temperature of the period at which higher temperatures promote scale, right? Well,
I think I know what you're trying to say. You're saying the higher temperature drives up the LSI.
correct. But the higher the temperature goes, it also lowers your pH ceiling according to the Henry Law chart. So you're kind of getting a trade-off. Now, granted, it's not huge, but it is
barely.
there.
Yeah, barely. It's worth considering, but barely.
Yeah. So we need to know, or we need to make sure that the LSI is still the main consideration here, because it's pretty key here for not degrading your surface, other equipment, things like that. Focus on the LSI.
It's not pretty. It's not pretty key.
Yeah.
It is everything.
Yes.
It's everything. This is an LSI question.
Yeah.
Now, there are some ways that we can put the LSI to our advantage.
Correct. Don't sacrifice your surface to make flakes go away, please. Don't do that.
Yeah, don't tank your pH on purpose. Now, let's rattle through what some of these solutions are. Okay. Jared had made mention of it. Number one, you could use SC1000. It buys you some grace on the LSI. It will inhibit scale. See, Jared, I said it correctly.
Good job.
It inhibits scale by binding to calcium in the water. Then focus on your carbonate alkalinity or your total alkalinity. Get your total alkalinity to like 60 or 70. But don't do that if you've got 180 calcium. You need more than that. In Miami, you probably even need 300 calcium to even consider going down that low, even though it's really hot.
To not sacrifice your LSI.
Right. Yeah. Always LSI is everything. So do not bottom out your LSI. Never go red on the LSI. And you also don't have to correct your pH down as low as you might think. You don't have to go down to 7.4. You might not have to hit 7.5 or 7.6. A lot of the customers I talked this problem through, they only drop down to 7.7 and they don't have flakes anymore.
And not just that, make sure you're measuring your acid, because what you think may be lowering it down to 7.4 is actually taking it down to 6.5.
Yeah, and refer back to the previous episodes. I don't know what numbers they were, but the 6 bad habits. Measure your chemicals, know the volume of your pool, dilute your acid. Don't, do things right. Let's go be proactive. Let's make sure that you are making these pH and alkalinity corrections properly. Don't just dump acid into your pool. That's going to complicate things. And then the other thing is you can allow your pump to circulate about 5 to 10 minutes after the salt cell turns off. But for the average do-it-yourself homeowner, this is not something you should even attempt to do. This is electrical wiring. This is something that needs to be consulted with a professional, with the manufacturers. And even then, it's really not that necessary with a variable speed pump, because that can circulate water, even if it's just slowly circulating, that can do it 24/7. Whereas if you have a single speed that shuts off for 12 hours or 16 hours a day, maybe increase your circulation time. Don't have as much downtime, have more run time. Whatever it is, you want water flushing out that salt cell. Another thing, don't run your salt system at 100%. There's no need for that. Even if you're falling behind, what you really need to do is supplement your chlorine, which is a different conversation that we've had before. Don't run it at 100%. That's not really sustainable. If you really want scale in your pool, that's how you do it. I tend to recommend 50 to 70 or sometimes 80%, depending on where the customer is. What do you recommend, Jared?
Yeah, around 70 to 80% is good. And like I said, this is also just important so you can control the longevity of this salt cell, because it will wear out. You will have to replace it eventually.
One thing that you might want to consider is what other calcium issues could you be looking at? It might not be salt flakes, right? I've seen people dump in bags of salt and then they brush it around, but it discolors a pigmented surface. Well, maybe they didn't brush it around enough, but what they really didn't do is pre-dissolve the salt. And now you might be listening to me and saying, I'm not pre-dissolving 30 bags of salt. I get that. But you got to at least brush it around and get it dissolved, and don't let it sit around on the bottom of the pool, because salt will discolor a pool. And I've seen it happen many times, and so have you, Jared, right?
Well, not just that. When you play with our app and you take the salt or TDS level to extremely high measurements, it makes the LSI more aggressive. So dumping straight salt on a surface is extremely aggressive.
Yeah.
If it just sits there, it's going to do what it's supposed to do.
Right. And the other thing is, don't ever do it in the first 30 days of a startup.
No.
Everybody agrees, because that affects the curing, the curing properties of cement, do not do it. I've seen people dump it in the first week. Disaster. Don't do that. So I think we've covered pretty much everything. Jared, do you want to try to summarize everything?
Mainly, if you're seeing flakes in your pool or spa, it's coming from the salt cell most of the time. And the reason that it's there is because the LSI is out of balance and you're probably maintaining an alkalinity too high for a salt cell. So let's make sure we get that total alkalinity down. Like I said, we recommend around 80 parts, which is going to push your carbonate alkalinity down, and being, Henry's law, have a better pH ceiling to help maintain the water for that salt system specifically. And then obviously SC1000 is there to assist you in this process. It's not the cure. Trust me. I've had too many people say, put in SC1000. Well, it didn't really help. It helped a little bit, but it's still there. Well, we can't do everything here. It does take chemical balancing and LSI.
Part.
Yeah.
If you do your part, we can guarantee our product will do its part, but it can't do everything. It's not a magic chemical. That's a good summary. I couldn't have said it better myself. If you are having this issue, you are not alone. Feel free to reach out to us at info@orendatech.com or on Facebook. We respond pretty quickly, or in the comments below this YouTube video if you're watching instead of listening. But we'd love to hear from you. But realistically, now that you've heard it, it is a pretty simple thing to prevent, and you should be able to be good to go without needing to call us. But we like hearing from people anyway here and there.
That's right.
So, Jared, anything you want to add?
Nope, we covered it.
All right, this has been episode 34 of the Rule Your Pool podcast. I'm Eric Knight, your host, and Jared, thank you for being back on the show.
Happy to be here. Thanks, everybody.
All right, take care, everyone.
Thank you for listening to Rule Your Pool, a podcast by Orenda Technologies. For more information on what we discussed in this week's episode, check the links in the description or visit www.orendatech.com.
I hope you find this show valuable enough that you tap that subscribe button and share it with your friends. You can also like us on Facebook and social media. And with our help, you'll be able to rule your pool without over-treating it with chemicals and wasting money. I'll see you next episode.